In the darkness of his bedroom at Graceland, when the crowds had gone home and the last echo of screaming fans had faded into Memphis night, Elvis Aaron Presley would sit by his window and remember what it felt like to be just a boy from Tupelo who sang because it was the only way he knew how to pray. The world knew him as the king of rock and roll, the man whose hips could make teenagers faint and whose voice could make grown women weep. But long before the gold records and the white jumpsuits, before Ed Sullivan and Las Vegas, before the world decided he was dangerous and revolutionary, there lived a shy child who stuttered when he was nervous and held his mother's hand too tightly when they walked through town together. They say that fame changes people, but sometimes it just makes them more of who they always were. More lonely if they were already alone, more afraid if they were already scared, more lost if they were already searching for something they couldn't name. Elvis was born into poverty on January 8, 1935, in a two-room house that his father Vernon built with his own hands from materials he couldn't quite afford. His twin brother Jesse Garin was stillborn, a ghost that would haunt Elvis his entire life. Gladys would tell him that he had the soul of two people inside him, that Jesse's spirit lived on through him, that he was meant to sing for both of them. It was a beautiful story that became a beautiful burden. How do you live for two people when you're still trying to figure out how to live for one? Gladys loved him with the fierce intensity of a woman who had lost one child and was determined not to lose another. She would walk him to school every day until he was 15 years old, not because she didn't trust him, but because the world felt too dangerous for someone so gentle, so sensitive, so easily hurt by the casual cruelty that children show to anyone who's different. And Elvis was different, not just because his family was poor, but because he carried something inside him that most people couldn't name. A softness that made other boys call him names. A sensitivity that made him cry at movies that were supposed to be funny. A voice that, even when he was young, seemed to carry more emotion than a child should be able to hold. The bullying started early and lasted longer than it should have. Boys who threw things at him and called him "Mama's boy," teachers who saw his shyness and mistook it for stupidity, classmates who laughed at his clothes that Gladys had sewn by hand. He learned to walk with his head down, to speak only when spoken to make himself as small as possible in hopes that the world might forget he was there. But some people are meant to be noticed, whether they want to be or not. The first time he discovered that his voice could do something magical was in church, when he was barely old enough to see over the pew. The congregation was singing an old hymn, and something in the melody made him open his mouth and let sound pour out. Not the tentative whisper of a shy child, but something rich and full and ancient, as if the music had been waiting inside him all his life for permission to escape. The church fell quiet. Then they fell apart. Women started crying, men started shouting hallelujah, and the preacher forgot what verse came next. In that moment, Elvis learned that his voice could make people feel things they hadn't known they needed to feel, could touch places in their hearts that they had forgotten existed. But he also learned that being able to touch people so deeply meant carrying the weight of their emotions along with your own. His mother bought him a guitar for his 11th birthday. Not because they had money for luxuries, but because she had seen something in his eyes when he listened to music. The guitar was secondhand and missing a string, but it might as well have been made of gold for how carefully he held it. He taught himself to play by listening to records and radio shows, spending hours in his room working out the fingerings for songs that seemed to understand him better than people did. The music became his language for feelings he couldn't speak out loud. The loneliness of being different, the fear of never being good enough, the love he felt for his mother that was too big for ordinary words. Then came the day that changed everything, when he walked into Sun Records to make a recording for his mother's birthday. $4 to record My Happiness, songs that seemed to speak directly to the ache in his chest that he couldn't name. Sam Phillips wasn't there that day, but his assistant, Marion Keisker, heard something in this nervous teenager's voice that made her write a note. Good ballad singer, hold. She didn't know she was documenting the moment when everything changed. The first time girls screamed for him, at a small club in Memphis when he was just 19, he thought they were screaming at him, that he had done something wrong, that his leg shaking was inappropriate. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard before, primal and desperate and hungry. He ran off stage that first night, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his guitar. It took several performances before he understood that the screaming was for him, that these strangers were responding to something he was giving them without knowing he was giving it. The leg that shook uncontrollably when he was nervous, the way his voice cracked with emotion. These weren't flaws to be corrected. They were the very things that made hearts beat faster. But understanding didn't make it easier. How do you live up to something you don't fully understand? How do you give people what they want when you're not entirely sure what it is you're giving them? Colonel Parker found him when he was still young enough to believe that older meant wiser, that success meant happiness, that fame would fill the empty places inside him that had always felt too big to fill. The colonel promised him the world, and he delivered it. But the world came with a price that nobody had explained in advance. The price was privacy first, then authenticity. Then slowly, the very self that had created the music that made him famous in the first place. The movies came next, and with them, a different kind of prison. Hollywood wanted Elvis the brand, not Elvis the artist. They wanted him to play himself over and over again until the self became a caricature, until the man disappeared entirely behind the image. Between takes, he would sit alone in his trailer, reading spiritual books, trying to understand why he felt so empty when he was surrounded by everything he thought he had wanted. The Army came in 1958, and for 2 years he almost remembered what it felt like to be ordinary. In Germany, away from the screaming and the cameras, he could walk down a street without causing a riot. He could sit in a coffee shop without being mobbed, could buy groceries without photographers following him home. For brief moments, he remembered what it felt like to be just another young man in uniform, serving his country like millions of others. The other soldiers treated him with a mixture of respect and careful distance. Some tried to befriend him, hoping for favors later. Others avoided him entirely, unsure how to relate to someone whose face appeared on magazine covers back home. But there were a few genuine friendships formed in those barracks, relationships based not on who Elvis was to the world, but on who he was at 3 in the morning when someone needed to talk about missing home. He wrote letters to Gladys every day. Long, rambling letters about Army food and German weather and how much he missed her cooking. He told her about the books he was reading, about the loneliness that followed him even here, thousands of miles from Memphis. He asked her to take care of herself, to see doctors if she wasn't feeling well, to remember that he would be home soon and everything would be like it used to be. But those 2 years also brought the deepest grief that he had ever known. Gladys, his beloved mother, died while he was away, serving his country. The telegram came on a Tuesday morning in August, delivered by a soldier whose face showed he understood the weight of the words he was carrying. Mrs. Gladys Presley passed away yesterday. Emergency leave approved. Elvis read the telegram 3 times before the words made sense, and when they did, something inside him broke that would never quite heal. The flight home from Germany felt like the longest journey of his life. He sat by the airplane window, watching clouds pass beneath him like cotton fields, remembering the nights when Gladys would sit by his bed and sing him to sleep with old gospel songs that promised better days ahead. She had been the one person who loved him unconditionally, not Elvis the performer, not Elvis the sensation, but the boy who had cried when other children were cruel. At the funeral, he broke down completely. The shy boy from Tupelo disappeared, and in his place was a man whose grief was so profound that even strangers wept to witness it. He threw himself on her casket and had to be pulled away by friends who understood that losing Gladys wasn't just losing a mother. It was losing the one person who had believed in him before the world did, who had seen him as enough just as he was. Without her, he felt unmoored, like a boat that had lost its anchor and was drifting further and further from shore. The letters she had written to him while he was in Germany became sacred documents that he read and reread until the paper grew soft from handling. She had worried about him eating enough, sleeping enough, staying warm enough. She signed them, "Your loving mother," as if he might have forgotten who she was. He came home from Germany, changed, quieter, more fragile somehow. The boy who had left was shy but hopeful. The man who returned carried a sadness that no amount of success could quite touch. The 60s brought new challenges. The Beatles had arrived with their own kind of magic, and suddenly rock and roll had evolved beyond what had made Elvis famous. He watched from the sidelines as younger artists took the crown he had worn, knowing that he had helped create the world that was now passing him by. But there were still moments of pure magic. The '68 comeback special, when he sat on a small stage in black leather and remembered why he had started singing in the first place. For 1 hour, the manufactured Elvis disappeared and the real one emerged, the one who had learned to sing in church, the one who had used music to speak feelings that were too deep for words. Las Vegas came later, and with it, a different kind of performance. The white jumpsuits and the elaborate staging, the twice-nightly shows that became as much spectacle as music. The International Hotel offered him financial security and a controlled environment where he could perform without the chaos of touring, but it also became a beautiful cage that he couldn't escape. Night after night, he would take the stage in front of audiences who had paid to see a legend, not a man. They wanted the hits, the moves, the familiar Elvis they had fallen in love with years or decades before. And he gave them what they wanted, even when giving it felt like giving away pieces of himself that he could never get back. There were moments of pure connection when a song would transport him back to the boy who had first discovered the power of his voice. Can't Help Falling in Love could still make him remember what it felt like to believe in forever. Love Me Tender could still make him think of Gladys and the way she would smile when he sang for her in their tiny house in Tupelo. But those moments became rarer as the shows became more routine, as the performance of being Elvis overtook the reality of being human. He could still move a crowd, still make them feel things they hadn't known they needed to feel, but something essential had been lost in the translation from intimate performer to larger-than-life entertainer. The Vegas audiences were polite, appreciative, but they weren't discovering him the way those early crowds had. They were consuming a product they had already decided they loved, and he was the machine that delivered that product twice a night, 7 days a week. Between shows, he would sit in his suite high above the city, looking out at the neon lights that never went dark, wondering how many other people down there felt as alone as he did. Vegas was a city built on illusion, on the promise that luck could change your life overnight, that transformation was possible if you just believed hard enough. But Elvis had learned that some transformations couldn't be undone, that some changes were permanent, whether you wanted them or not. The prescription drugs started as a way to keep up with the demands of performing every night, then became a way to sleep, then became a way to exist in a world that felt increasingly unreal. They promised escape from the loneliness that fame had brought, from the weight of being responsible for so many people's dreams, from the gap between who he was and who everyone needed him to be. He tried to find love again and again in relationships with women who were attracted to Elvis but couldn't quite reach the man underneath. The irony was crushing. He was the most desired man in America, yet he spent most nights alone, calling friends at 3 in the morning just to hear another human voice, just to remember that connection was possible even when it felt impossible. There were women who loved the idea of Elvis more than they could love the reality of him. They were drawn to the fame, the excitement, the reflected glow of being seen with the king of rock and roll. But when the lights went down and the performance ended, when he sat in his robe reading spiritual texts or talking about his mother with tears in his eyes, they didn't know what to do with that version of him. Priscilla came closest, perhaps, to understanding both versions of him, the public performer and the private seeker. She had met him when she was barely 14 and he was 24 at a party in Bad Nauheim while he was stationed in Germany. She saw him not as Elvis Presley, the sensation, but as a lonely soldier far from home who talked about his mother with tears in his eyes and read books about finding meaning in a world that often felt meaningless. Their courtship was conducted largely through letters and phone calls, which allowed him to be more himself than any relationship he had ever had. On paper, he could be vulnerable without performing vulnerability, could share his thoughts about God and death and the weight of carrying other people's dreams without worrying about whether he was being Elvis enough. Priscilla fell in love with the words he wrote in the quiet hours before dawn, when Graceland was still and his heart was unguarded. In those letters, He wrote about feeling like two different people trapped in the same body, the one the world wanted and the one he actually was. He wrote about missing his mother so much that some mornings he forgot she was gone and would reach for the phone to call her. He wrote about the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people all day but having no one who really knew him. But even she couldn't bridge the gap between the life he lived and the life he dreamed of living. The man she had fallen in love with through letters was increasingly unavailable in person, hidden behind the demands of being Elvis Presley every waking moment. Their marriage became another performance, another way of giving the public what it wanted: the image of the king with his queen, the fantasy of the perfect life that fame could buy. The truth was lonelier than the fantasy. Even in his own home, surrounded by friends and family and staff, he felt isolated in a way that was difficult to explain to people who had never lived inside a legend. Every conversation was filtered through the awareness that he was Elvis first, human being second. Every relationship was complicated by the question of whether people loved him or loved what he represented, whether they saw him or saw the version of him that existed in their imaginations. Graceland, which was supposed to be his sanctuary, became another kind of prison. The gates were meant to keep the world out, but they also kept him in. Beyond those gates waited a world that saw him as public property, as someone who belonged to them more than he belonged to himself. His daughter Lisa Marie became his anchor to something real, something beyond the performance. When he held her, he remembered what it felt like to be needed for who he was rather than what he could do. "Daddy," she would say in her small voice, "why do you look sad when you sing?" And he would try to explain that sometimes singing made him happy and sad at the same time, like remembering something beautiful that was also gone forever. In the quiet hours before dawn, when Graceland was finally still and the phones had stopped ringing, he would sit at his piano and play the old songs, the hymns his mother had taught him, the ballads that had made him cry as a child, the simple melodies that reminded him of when music was prayer instead of product. Those were the moments when the shy boy from Tupelo was most visible, when the king of rock and roll disappeared and left behind someone smaller, more fragile, more human, someone who still wondered if he was good enough, if he was loved for who he was or for what he could do, if the applause would ever be loud enough to drown out the silence inside his own heart. The later years brought new sadness, new struggles with the weight of being Elvis Presley every day of his life. The voice that had once seemed effortless now required more effort to maintain. The body that had moved with such natural grace now needed help to achieve the same effects. The man who had once been criticized for being too dangerous was now being criticized for being too sad, too heavy, too human. Yet even in decline, something magical remained. The voice, when it was working, could still break hearts and mend them in the same breath. There were moments during the Vegas shows when he would stop mid-song and start talking to the audience, not as Elvis the entertainer, but as a person sharing something real with other people. He would talk about his mother, about loneliness, about the strange life he had lived. The prescription drug dependency that had started as medical necessity became a medical emergency more times than the public ever knew. There were mornings when his staff wasn't sure if he would wake up, performances where he forgot lyrics to songs he had sung thousands of times. But there were also moments of startling clarity when the fog would lift and he would remember exactly who he had been before the world told him who he should be. During those clear moments, he talked about wanting to tour internationally, about wanting to go to Europe and see the faces of fans who had loved him from across an ocean. The Colonel always found reasons why it wasn't possible. What Elvis never knew was that his manager couldn't risk leaving the country due to his own legal issues. So Elvis remained trapped in America, trapped in Las Vegas, trapped in a version of success that felt more like failure. He studied Eastern philosophy, Christian mysticism, anything that might help him make sense of why he had been chosen for this particular burden. He underlined passages about suffering and transformation, about losing yourself to find yourself, about the cost of carrying light for other people when your own darkness feels overwhelming. Friends would later say that in his final months there were moments when you could see him fighting to remember who he had been before the world told him who he should be. He talked about wanting to make different kinds of music, about wanting to disappear somewhere quiet where he could remember the person who had existed before Elvis Presley became a global phenomenon. The morning they found him, August 16, 1977, the headlines screamed about the death of the king, about the end of an era, about the loss of an American icon. Radio stations played his songs back to back, and fans gathered at Graceland with flowers and tears and memories. But somewhere in that quiet bathroom at Graceland, it was the shy boy from Tupelo who had finally stopped searching for a way to be both Elvis and himself at the same time. The funeral drew 80,000 mourners to Memphis, a testament to the size of the hole his death had left in the American consciousness. Perhaps the most telling moment came when they carried his body out of Graceland for the last time. The silence was so complete that you could hear birds singing in the trees he had planted. The same trees that had provided shade for a boy who had once dreamed of being famous enough to matter. He left behind a catalog of music that would outlive empires, performances that would be studied for generations, and a style of moving through the world that changed how we think about charisma and vulnerability. But he also left behind questions that don't have easy answers, about the cost of giving so much of yourself to strangers that there's nothing left for the people who love you, about what happens to the quiet person inside when the public person becomes too large to contain. There's a recording of him that most people have never heard, a rehearsal from 1954 when he was still figuring out how to use his voice. In it, you can hear him laugh between verses, can hear him asking if he's doing it right, can hear the wonder in his voice when he realizes he's created something beautiful. That recording tells the real story. Not the jumpsuit years or the movie contracts or the Vegas spectacles, but the moment when a shy boy discovered that he could use his voice to touch something sacred in other people, could transform loneliness into connection through the simple act of singing. They say he lives forever now in the music and the movies, and the memories of people who saw him perform when touching an audience still felt like magic instead of work, and maybe that's true. Maybe there's a kind of immortality in becoming so essential to the soundtrack of people's lives that your voice becomes part of their emotional landscape. But sometimes, late at night, when the world gets quiet, you have to wonder about the boy who loved his mother too much and the world too little, who learned to sing because it was the only language that felt adequate for the feelings he carried. You have to wonder if, somewhere beyond all the gold records and screaming crowds, he finally found the thing he was looking for all along, a place where he could be loved for who he was when the music stopped. The quiet side of Elvis Presley was never a mystery to solve or a sadness to pity. It was simply the part of him that remained achingly human in a world that wanted him to be superhuman, the part that remembered what it felt like to be ordinary in a life that had become anything but. The boy from Tupelo who sang in church never really left. He just learned to sing louder, to move more boldly, to give more of himself to strangers until there wasn't enough left for himself. But in the quiet moments, when the crowds were gone and the lights were down, he was still there, still shy, still searching, still singing because it was the only way he knew how to pray. And maybe that's enough. Maybe being remembered for bringing joy to millions is its own kind of beautiful legacy. But somewhere in the space between Elvis the King and Elvis the Man, there's a story that whispers rather than shouts. A story about what it costs to be everything to everyone else while remaining nothing to yourself. In the end, maybe that's what made him the king. Not the crown that fame placed on his head, but the understanding that everyone, no matter how different they seem, is just looking for a song that sounds like home. The shy boy from Tupelo spent his whole life singing other people's songs until he found his own voice, and when he did, the world couldn't help but listen. But the price of that listening was the silence in his own heart, the quiet place where little boys from Mississippi dream of being loved for who they are, not for who they become. That quiet place was where Elvis truly lived, even when the world only saw the king. And maybe that's the most human thing about someone who became larger than life, that underneath all the performance and all the pain, there was always just a boy who wanted to belong somewhere, who wanted to matter to someone, who wanted to sing his way home to a love that would never ask him to be anything other than exactly who he was when the music stopped playing and the lights went down and there was nothing left but the sound of his own heartbeat in the Memphis darkness.